Really excellent talk. A lot of data and a lot of mechanistic data, which is not always the case. And not in this part like evolutionary directed.
Yeah.
And I was not able to follow well with this demethylation story. So there is like demethylation needed to start this signaling pathway to.
Well, I think. I mean, I don't know if it's acetylation or demethylation. Acetylation might work too. I mean, we haven't examined that yet, but I know that demethylated CD38, demethylated oxytocin, right? That gene needs to be demethylated, and oxytocin receptor needs to be demethylated. So those things I know within oxytocin neurons actually need to be. Tyrosine hydroxylase, which is the rate-limiting enzyme for dopamine, also needs to be demethylated. So that's why we chose that particular, that's why we chose Horizon, just because I was kind of thinking of targeting those as opposed to just like demethylation in general. Yeah. So again, we have to, and I mean, it clearly knocked out the effect within oxytocin and vasopressin neurons, right? So they weren't activated. Why were they not activated? Because something that would normally activate them also wasn't demethylated and was kept tight within chromatin. I don't know yet. We have to follow up on that. And I could probably spend the next 10 years following up on that, which I fully intend to once my lab is up and running. But it's like I really, that's why we chose it. Because I knew that we were targeting oxytocin and dopamine.
And if I may, one more question. Sure. You have shown this like synapse dopaminergic modulation and opioid modulation on oxytocin neurons. So did I get it right that you suggest that this coincidence of release of dopamine and opioid on oxytocin neuron is the mechanism underlying bond establishment?
Yeah. Right? Well, in our hands, that is the. I don't know if that's going to work for prairie voles. It might. It probably does, but it might not be on oxytocin for them. It might be on vasopressin for them. It might be on both oxytocin and vasopressin. We have to look. But for our conditioned activation, I think it needs both the dopamine and the oxytocin.
It's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, I do have plenty of questions. My question is that. So, in general. Of course, experience matters. That was clearly shown. But then we can ask: so why we are not all fetishists, or are we?
Yeah. Well, are we? It's a good question. I mean, see, the thing is, a fetish is either going to be something completely unrelated, if we use a conservative definition, or it's going to be everything that you find attractive. Because individually, we all have individual differences in what we find attractive, yeah? Which is a good thing, because it means that everybody, regardless of how we look, is going to be found attractive by at least one other person out there, right? That's on the good side. But on the other side, then, do we say that, oh, well, if I only like, dark-haired women of a certain body type, or I only like men or women or others, is that a fetish? Is that right? Is that a paraphilia? Yeah. And I think that there are so many paraphilias, for example. I mean, there's like 567 that have been actually given names. There's probably even more than that. They're so individual that it makes you think that there's almost a randomness to kind of the idea of whatever gets there first wins. Yeah. Like certainly the jacket study would indicate to me that if you happen to be wearing a jacket, or if you happen to be, I don't know, like you think of the 1950s and cars that had leather seats and the back seat was full of crunchy leather and people were having their first sexual experiences with crunchy leather, smelling crunchy leather, did some of them make that association to the point that either they really like to be in the back seat of a car, which would be like an opera fetish, or they need leather. Right?
Okay, so what was important, what you just said was that some become.
Exactly.
And then what I'm trying to follow is that apparently some people are more flexible and they are more depending on their experience, and some it's difficult to be shaped. So that's what I'm wondering is this interactive effect.
Yeah.
But we can see that in rats, whether there are individual differences, which rats are more prone to previous experience and which are.
Exactly. So that's an important question. So you're asking actually, there could be a randomness of presentations, but some individuals are real bonders. Right? Like, I don't know, you see this, I don't know if they do this on Valentine's Day, but they used to do this in Canada all the time. They would always get a couple that had been together for like 70 years. Okay? And they're like two really old people, and they're both holding each other's hands, and they look at each other's eyes, and it's all so beautiful. It's Valentine's Day, oh my God, they're in love. And they've been in love since they were 12. Right? So you have bonders, and then you have non-bonders. And so what's the actual variation of those? And of the ability of these systems to function. And some individuals, for example, who don't have oxytocin, or who have some truncated oxytocin receptor, or have, like you think of the Romanian orphans, right, who have autism. Now, because they weren't touched when they were babies, they can't stand to be touched. And the idea of kissing, the idea of having sex for them is like aversive. They don't want to do it. And who do they find attractive? They don't. You show them pictures of people and they go, oh, I know that's Brad Pitt, but is he attractive? I don't know. Like, they don't know what that is because they don't have the mechanism. So I think on one side, you've got people that don't have the mechanism who don't form these. You've got people that maybe have an overexpression of it who do. And the question then is, well, okay, do these become the real paraphiles? Right? Are these the ones within that magnitude of whatever that genetic spread is? Are they the ones that now have an overactive bonding system? And do they bond when they get sexually aggressed against as children? Do they bond with their first experience? Do they bond with maybe not necessarily the first sexual experience, but they have a hard time having an orgasm? And so they're kind of on the sixth lover, and they're having sex, and the lover just like smacks them on the ass, and all of a sudden that's a sympathetic arouser, and it breaks on through, and now they have the first orgasm. And instead of thinking, oh, wow, I was spanked, now they're thinking, oh, I like to be spanked. And that becomes then an operant for their orgasm. That's a possibility, right? But it's kind of a new way of looking at what this would actually be. It's a very important question.
Okay, another point is with the first experience, and what you just said was important. I think that because in humans, actually the effect of first sexual experience, dyadic experience, is not really strong. But it might not be the first sexual experience.
It might be the first orgasm.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's right.
And so that.
See, rats just have it. They don't live in a culture that says don't touch yourself, don't masturbate, you're bad, you're a sinner, you're this or that. They don't live in that culture. So females, if the male doesn't respond, if they're left up to their own desires, they go find another male. So there's no hampering. There's no slut shaming, there's no shame, there's no any of that, right? And they, are getting what they want because they're in complete control of it. So for them, I don't think there's an orgasm gap like there is in humans. Yeah.
Any question? Because I'm still having some. Okay, I'll follow up. So wait. So you try, so what you showed us was chickens, different odors, but did you try some multimodal experiment? Because apparently from other studies we know that some modalities or even some stimuli are more salient than others.
Yeah. No, that's the next. That's actually one of the first ones I want to do, which is to see. So, if the odor, which is really salient to a rat, because they live in the factory world, if the odor means yes, and the jacket means nothing, presumably the odor is going to work. If the odor means yes, and the jacket means no, now what? Right? Because I mean, I think something on you it's present. You feel it, right? And maybe it's not distal, it's much more proximal. So will proximality versus distality take over? Or will the sensory cue, which is much more potent, take over? So will they go with yes or will they go with no? And then vice versa, right? So, yeah. So I don't know the answer to that, but we definitely want to do that, right? One thing I can tell you is that we can take an odor like, I didn't show you this, but we did a study where we took cadaverine, which is a really noxious odor. It's an odor, it's polyamine, it's given off by decaying flesh. And rats actually bury their dead, which is a problem for cultural anthropologists in the 1960s when this was discovered, because burial of the dead was actually taken as an unambiguous sign of culture. So rats do it because they stink, right? When you bury them, you eat their internal organs and you bury them and they don't stink anymore. So that's why rats do it. But cultural anthropologists had to shift their idea of what culture actually means. If rats are doing it, they don't live in culture. Anyway, that's a funny aside. So we did this where we paired them with females that wore cadaverine. Now, first off, would male rats copulate with a dead-smelling female? And yes, they will. Okay, because again, earth boys are easy. But then, on the final test, now we know that if we take a prod and we put cadaverine on it, and rats have like bedding, they'll move the bedding, they'll bury it, essentially they'll bury the prod with the bedding. Yeah? Okay, so we asked the question, first off, open field test, unscented versus scented, what do? Well, they showed a preference for the cadaverine-scented female over the unscented female, whereas in the unpaired group, they're literally 100% going after the unscented female versus the dead smelling. We also had a group that we tried to habituate them to the odor, so we put the dowel in their home cage every day, which they buried. Okay, so they don't really habituate, and they also were 100% overdone. Okay, but then 4 days later, we put a dowel in the home cage again. Yeah, the other two groups buried the dowel, but or they didn't contact it. I mean, some of them respond by like freaking out and going in a corner and not, and like they just like turn their back to it and they just stay in that position. The other ones went to the dowel and picked it up and chewed on it. And that's crazy because cadaverine is caustic. So I think they're showing that the pairing of the odor, the nasty odor, with sexual reward turns it from an unconditionally aversive thing to a kind of a conditionally appetitive thing. Right? I mean, in a way that makes for cigarette smoke, cigarettes are disgusting. Right? They're just disgusting. And they smell bad. I think they probably taste bad. I've never smoked, but people have told me that the first time they had one, they hated it. They coughed, they wondered about how, and months later, they're like, oh, well, I prefer this brand over that brand. How does that even work, right? So they're clearly taking something, and the nicotine reward effect, which induces activation of opioids and dopamine, and sensitizes dopamine. Each puff they take is activating dopamine. So you're sensitizing the cue and now associating it with reward, and now you've taken that aversive thing and turned it into a conditionally appetitive thing. Yeah? I mean, rats don't like bitter. Yeah? They put morphine in their water. Right? At first they'll lick it and show rejection responses, but it's the only source of water they have, so they have to drink bitter water. So they drink it more, they drink it more. After a month of daily drinking morphinated water, you give them a choice between morphine water and regular water, and they choose the morphine water. Right? So it's you can take an aversive thing and make it conditionally appetitive. And that doesn't require first experience. Yeah.
I wonder, are there any data about relation between fear and sexual arousal? Because, or how to measure it? I studied toxoplasma, and effects on their effects on behavior of rodents and humans. And it is known that normal mice and rats are afraid of smell of cat and they try to run away. But after infection, they like smell of cat and they try to stay in these places where they smell cat urine, for example. And I have a suspicion that I suspect that there is in fact sexual attraction, that somehow stimuli which normally induce fear start to induce also sexual arousal, and therefore infected mice try to stay when they smell cat. Is there any data which can support this, or are there any tests which can be used to test this?
I think it would be actually really easy to test this, but things that were done in the past. So, for example, Frank Beach, who was one of the originators of behavioral endocrinology, Beach did a study in the 1950s. He tried his damnedest to shock animals to not have sex, and every time he shocked male rats, they would have sex more vigorously, right? So it's like the shock, even shock that was painful, that the rats would, like they would just run over to the receptive female and have sex even more vigorously. Yeah. If you make an expectancy with, do you know the forced swim task? So you have a glass cylinder that's like this, and it's got water. Okay, so you put the rat in, and the rat is trying to get out and can't because they can't go to the bottom and jump up, and they don't know how to do that. So eventually they just and they are going to drown. So you got to grab them out, and it's a test that's been used for it's clearly aversive, and it's something that's been used to look at learned helplessness, right? Because they get helpless faster each time you put them in, right? And until the point that you put them in, they just go, and then you pull them out. I mean, but you're conditioning something. You're also conditioning their knowledge that they are, in fact, going to be pulled out. Okay? And rats do like to swim, right? So, anyway, it is aversive. How do we know? Because when you put them in a holding bin that has an odor that's associated with we use the almond odor, has an odor that's associated with the swim task, yeah? They have what are called stress fecal matter, so they poo a lot, right? And it smells because it's stress poos have a certain odor to them. So they do this a lot, and you make your undergraduate count the number of fecal boli that the animals have produced, right? And if there's no odor, because that's associated with going into the little chamber but there's no water in it, then they don't show that effect. Okay. So we did a study where we did exactly that, but on the last day, and the rats weren't sexually naive, but on the last day, we put them in either the scent, which indicated they're going to drown, or the no scent, that indicated that they're not. But then we gave them sex. Right? And what happened? The ones who got the scent, who had showed plenty of stress poo, they looked like they had gotten 10 to 20 milligrams per kilogram of cocaine. They ejaculated more, they were much more vigorous, right, than the other ones who weren't stressed out or had no expectation of stress. Yeah? So I think what you're doing is actually that plus, because you're now desensitizing the toxoplasmosis is desensitizing the olfactory system to the cues that are associated with it. I mean, it'd be interesting if that's a real thing. Like if that's something that might even also be making people prefer non-reproductive sex. Like that's a possibility. It's hard to say, but I think you'd find that it would facilitate. So it'd be cool. Oh, that's my phone. Anyway.
Okay, so if there are no more formal questions, we can move to pub and have some more informal discussion there. Okay, so thanks very much once again.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.